So I'm Chris, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning with Evan and with other members of our research team over here. And I'm going to just briefly sort of give a little bit of context for this project, how it came to be and why we're doing it, say a little bit about that background, and then I'll turn it over to Evan, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the current state of research on the non-religious and how what we're trying to do sort of is new and different and trying to address some of the gaps in the existing literature. So this project, I can sort of trace its roots back in a formal way to 2016. I was living out east. I was serving as the director of the Yale humanist community after having served as a humanist chaplain at Harvard University. And so I had been spending at that point about 8 years or so working as a humanist community builder, specifically serving campus populations, but also doing programming that was open to the general public and having a lot of members of the broader community come to our community events seeking out opportunities to gather as non-religious people and reflect on their lives, find community, and act on their values. And so that's my professional background. That's what I have done for the better part of a decade. And as I was, at that point, I was sort of considering coming back to Minnesota. I grew up here. My family all lives here. It's always been sort of my long-term goal. And I entered into conversations with folks here at FUS, as well as other atheist and humanist and secular communities in Minnesota. And we started talking about what it would look like to explore the possibility of a Center for Humanist Life here in Minnesota that served a broader range of members of the sort of religiously unaffiliated population than are currently being served by the existing humanist and secular and atheist communities and institutions here in Minnesota. And as we started exploring this conversation, I was doing a lot of reflecting on what I had learned over the last 8 years or so, building humanist communities. And one of the things that I had started suspecting was that there was this huge swath of the secular population that we were not reaching, that we were not serving. A really large percentage of people who were not religious, who still have the same needs for community, for reflection that religious people have, but weren't being served or reached by our efforts to build communities for non-religious people. And I wanted to understand why. I wanted to understand why it was that we were not reaching these folks, and whether or not it was just an awareness gap problem, or whether or not it had something to do with the way that we were building community. And I started suspecting that maybe our efforts, which were to look at how religious communities organize themselves and try to create a sort of humanist secular alternative, whether or not we were making some assumptions there about what this population actually wants and needs out of community, what community means to them, what their practices are currently for how they reflect on their lives and make meaning. And I decided that it might be helpful to take a kind of community organizing approach and try to better understand the needs and practices of this population first, so that if we were to establish a humanist center here in Minnesota, we could establish it in response to a sort of deeper understanding of what this population actually wants and needs, and how it's currently meeting those needs. And so I wanted to better understand what sort of data currently existed. And Evan and I had been in touch for years, and Evan lived here. And so we got together and chatted about it, and it became clear to me that based on Evan's deep understanding of the sort of landscape of research, that there was a lot that we didn't know, that the data really couldn't tell us as much as I wanted to understand about this population. But fortunately, Evan and Jackie are both at the University of Minnesota, and both one of, I would say, a very small handful of people who are currently doing really important, rich research on the religiously unaffiliated. And not only was it fortunate that they're here and doing that work, but they were interested in and open to working with us on developing a survey that would address some of those gaps in our understanding, that would help us better understand the non-religious population so that we could find out, is a humanist center something that the majority of religiously unaffiliated people would actually want? Is it something that they would get involved in? And if so, what should it be offering them? What kinds of programming would they be looking for? What kinds of community gatherings would be meaningful to them? How are they currently sort of making sense of their lives? And maybe what's missing in the ways in which they're doing that a humanist center could offer them. So we've now been working for a year and a half, year-ish, on developing a survey. It's a totally new process for me, so I've been learning a lot. I'm very fortunate to work with super knowledgeable and super patient individuals who can teach me a great deal about how to develop a good survey. And we've been working regularly on that, getting feedback from others, and we now have a survey that we feel pretty excited about, that we think will get us some of the information that we're looking for. And I think at this point, I'll probably turn it over to you, Evan, to say a little bit more.
Sure. Cool. Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Evan Stewart. As Chris mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota and a new assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, starting in the fall. And my research is in sociology, in political sociology, and in cultural sociology. And I'm interested in why people leave institutions. Right? Why people decide to stop participating in particular social groups, why people might lose trust in particular social groups, why they decide to make changes in their lives, why they decide to move on, and what they do after they decide to leave particular social groups or institutional arrangements. I'm super happy to be with you all today. This is a really fascinating and fun project. It's been a joy to work with Chris, to work with my colleague Jackie, our assistant Emily. It's a really fascinating project because it really shows the stakes of some of these research questions at the local level in real people's lives. So I'm just going to make a few comments here to kind of set the stage, to give you a little background on how we think about this problem, what we know about this problem, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A to take questions from you about anything you would like to know about our project, about the broader literature on non-religious Americans, and sort of where our project is going. So for background, I'd like to try something really quick just to give you a sense of what's happened over the last 30 years in the United States. If all the people in the front row could just raise your hand a little bit and just wiggle your fingers, if everyone just looks their hands, yeah? Yeah? Okay. Now, could everybody in the first 3 rows do that? Right? That changes the dynamic, right? That's a much larger proportion of the room, right? There's been a dramatic shift over the past 30 years in how people in the United States think about their religious identities and their religious commitments. In the 1980s, only about 7% of people, when surveyed and asked, what's your religious preference, would check none of the above. Most people would be able to give survey researchers some label for how they thought about their religious identity, be it Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, all the way down a laundry list, and only about 7% of people would check none of the above. For reference, I'm a survey researcher. We like to make weird comparisons between groups of people. That's about half as many people as say they believe in Bigfoot. About 14% of the US population believes in Bigfoot. So very small group, comparatively speaking. Lots of people in real life, right? 7% of the American population is sizable, right? But relatively speaking, a very small group, right? Just sort of the front row here. But since that time, the number of people checking none of the above has more than tripled, right? Now we have 3 rows of people wiggling their fingers, right? It's now 23% of the US population. For another comparison, that's equal to or larger in size than Catholics. It's equal to or larger in size than evangelical Protestants. And it makes non-religious people the largest religious minority group in the United States. No contest, the largest. Right, so that's a radical social change. That's nearly a quarter of the population. And so my research started when I first learned about this rising statistic, and realized, my old undergraduate advisor said, no one really knows what this means. No one really knows what to do with this. We don't know what's going on. We have a sense that this is happening. We have a couple basic explanations, but no one really knows what this means, what the implications are going to be for the American population or American culture. So I came to the University of Minnesota. I started doing research on this, and I quickly found that when we talk about non-religious Americans, we're not just talking about atheists, right? Folks who say they don't believe in God. We're not just talking about agnostics, folks who say they're unsure about whether or not there is a God, right? We're talking about a much, much broader group of people who feel that they're nothing in particular, folks who feel that they're none of the above, right? Currently in the United States, atheists are only about 4% of the population. Agnostics are only about 4% of the population. So that's about 8% in total, right? The remaining 15%, I could do math before noon, the remaining 15% are just none of the above, right? So I really found the need to sort of dive into those folks' lives, right? Dive into them in the survey data and think, okay, who are these people? What do they believe in, right? How do they live their lives? What is going on in their communities, right? And how can organizations like First Unitarian, other secular groups, other community organizations best serve them? And in the research literature, there are many, 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 many different reasons people leave religious institutions. Everyone has a very personal, detailed story. But there are two sort of big genres we can pull out of all these stories. The first genre is one that many people are familiar with. I call it the break story, or the breakup story. These are folks who made the conscious decision to leave a religious organization. These are people who leave a religious group because it doesn't fit their beliefs anymore. These are people who leave a religious group because it doesn't fit their politics anymore. These are people who leave religious groups because they no longer feel at home there, right? They decide, this is not for me. I don't think I agree with this. I have to leave. Then there's another story. There's the drift story. These are people who never decided just to leave, to up and one day say, nope, I'm not religious anymore. These are people who went to church on Sunday, maybe grew up religious, got in the habit, continued doing it. And then, as part of growing up, their lives got busy. These are folks who, because of familial pressures, because of economic change, because of other considerations, they just sort of step back, right? They stop attending these organizations. They sort of drift away. They don't necessarily think of themselves as atheists, agnostics. They don't think of themselves as people who have broken up with their religion. They just kind of drifted away. And one of the core problems we have in the research, one of the core problems we have in social science, is we like to listen to people who sound like me. We like to listen to extroverts. We like to listen to talkers. We like to listen to people who will sit down and talk for hours about who they are and what they like in their lives and what they don't like and their preferences. People who like to argue, right? And so research has only really understood the folks who have broken up with their religion, right? We have a wealth of research on atheists and atheist communities. We have a wealth of research on people who have left the church because the church, broadly speaking, because they feel like it no longer fits their politics, right? Progressive, often. We don't have a lot of research, though, on the majority of people who have just drifted away, right? And this is where we really come into our project and we really start to learn new and interesting things about the population. For example, when we take the whole group of folks who say that they're none of the above, uniformly, they often don't go to church, right? They have really low levels of participation in religious organizations and institutions. That makes sense. That's consistent, right? But their belief in God, ask them whether they believe in God, ask them how sure they are about their belief in God, it's all over the map. There are religiously unaffiliated people who are absolutely certain that there is a God or higher power. There are religiously unaffiliated people who are assured atheists, and there are people everywhere in between. What we find is that when we really try to match up people's beliefs with their identities and their behaviors, we find all of these wonderful mixtures, right? All of these people with a wide variety of interests in community, wide variety of interests and belief in the supernatural, wide variety of ways of engaging with religion, even though they're none of the above. And this, we think, is a really important finding. This is why we are designing the survey we are designing, because surveys are difficult. And it's oftentimes difficult to get the proper measures to build these sort of complex and rich and detailed profiles of people's lives, right? As a survey researcher, I specialize in overgeneralizing about things. I like to talk about trends. I like to talk about, where the populations are moving. I like to talk about the big ideas going on. And it's very difficult, right, for us to get a profile of the actual experience on the ground, right? People's lives are complicated. We know that people don't always necessarily live out their faith commitments in a consistent or a coherent way, right? People don't always necessarily care about little contradictions or things that don't make sense in their belief systems, right? They stick with their religion because it provides an identity or a sense of community. For other people, those contradictions are a huge problem. They can't stand them. It bugs them, right? And they have to leave. They have to go to a more coherent belief system, or they have to give up a belief system altogether. But we don't understand, right, how these people are living their everyday lives in a broad systemic way that a survey can capture. And that's what we're currently working on. My colleague Jackie does amazing work embedded in secular communities, right? Studying how this population understands what it means to be in a community, right? What it means to build a community, what it means to come together as a community, right? And to better understand what the religiously unaffiliated population is looking for in a community, what kinds of social support they want, right? My own personal research focuses on politics, right? So I study how this group is engaged in politics. I study whether they vote, how they think about political issues, how they evaluate candidates. And then together with Chris, we're really trying to work on, right, what this population in Minnesota wants in order to build a humanist center that better serves their interests and their needs. So, with that, I hope this was helpful for setting some context, right? I hope this was helpful for sort of broadening your understanding about the non-religious, right? And I think we can turn it over to Q&A and leave lots of time for questions, right? Because we love answering questions, right? We could tell you more about the status of our project. We could tell you more about what we've learned so far, what we are learning about secular populations, either in Minnesota or across the nation. I think that'll work, yeah. Thank you very much for having us. We're really happy to be here. Happy to take any questions.
Hi. I wondered if, Jackie, is your research on all secular organizations or non-religious secular organizations?
Oh, yeah.
Welcome to the stage, Jackie Frost.
Hey, everyone. I'm in the social department with Evan at the University of Minnesota. So my dissertation so far has been on the Sunday Assembly, which actually used to meet in this basement. So I spent 3 years with them kind of right when they started, kind of asking, why are you starting? What are people looking for? And then I've interviewed 35 people non-religious people who don't attend any kinds of groups like this or Minnesota Atheists or the Sunday Assembly to kind of get a sense of why they aren't attending and what they might want to attend. So I've been in and out of a lot of non-religious communities, especially Minnesota, but I've focused on the Sunday Assembly. So.
I take it you've developed the survey at this point. There is a physical survey you have. Jointly, you've done this. Is that? Right?
Yes, it's on a computer, but yes, there is a physical survey.
Okay, my first question about that part of it. Okay, who do you intend to survey? Now, she's talking to some people that she goes out and selects. But how do you survey all the others?
This is a great question.
The non-joiners.
Let's talk about survey methods. This is fun. So this is an excellent question. We are currently seeking funding to field the survey. There are now today multiple ways to get a good representative sample. We have consulted with the Wilder Foundation, which is a nonprofit research organization here in the Twin Cities, to figure out ways to field a survey to Twin citizens or Minneapolis residents. We use random selection methods. Usually it's random digit dial telephone surveys, but now the field is moving to address-based sampling, so they get a postal records list of all the addresses in a particular area, randomly sample addresses, send the survey out to them. We also have experimented with some online methods of doing similar random sampling. But the idea is to collect a representative, randomly selected sample of participants. And we need a fairly large sample, right? Because if the population is now about 23% who's religiously unaffiliated, we want to make sure we calibrate it in so that 23% roughly of our survey sample who are going to be religiously unaffiliated is a big enough number, right? So if we want to make sure we have at least 500 religiously unaffiliated people, right, we need a sample size that is much, much larger than that, right? So we're in the process of establishing a sample size that can capture that. The idea being that we will pick up people who won't necessarily opt into the survey because we say, hey, we're surveying atheists. Do you want to talk to us if you're an atheist? Hey, we're surveying agnostics. Do you want to talk? We just say, hey, we're surveying people, right? And by doing that to a broad enough range of people with a strong enough random selection, we'll be able to pick up many, many more people who can answer survey questions and give us a profile of their religious experiences, their non-religious experiences, without necessarily having self-selected in, right? So this is how we get around that problem I mentioned of talking to people who have strong identities and strong opinions and would love to tell you about them, right?
So out of in the metro area, I guess, is that your target population?
Yeah, we're doing two versions of the survey. So we have a version that we will be hopefully distributing to the metro area, right. And we have same version of the questions that we hope to distribute to a national sample, right? So sampling nationwide to be able to compare to the metro area. Potentially also doing a comparative survey across Minneapolis and Boston.
So 500 people out of 3.5 million will be a sufficient sample to drill down into many levels and layers of detail about who and why and how'd you get there and why are you?
I should be clear for the metro area, the 3.5 million, right? So we would draw a sample of, I'm estimating proportion. We would draw a sample of, at minimum, about 2,000 people in total, right? So then the subsample of roughly, 300 to 500 people, maybe more, they will be sufficient to get trends out of, yeah. Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to say, Evan, is I'm just surprised you're getting a job as an assistant professor because so many people, PhDs, go into teaching at universities and wound up being adjunct faculty where they have to cobble together a career that pays them almost zip compared to what they paid their college for college. Anyway, but what I want to ask, what is the age range of these people? Is it younger people or are there older people in it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I'm an atheist and have been for decades.
Oh, yeah, that's a fantastic question. So there is a very wide age range. We can find people who have been committed atheists for all their lives, right? I will say in terms of trends, right? If we were to say, okay, what factors predict whether or not someone has a high possibility of being non-religious, they do tend to be younger, right? We do see that a lot of this growth, it's about 23% of the population that are unaffiliated. It's about 33% of people who are under the age of 40, right? So this population does skew younger in the general trends, right? But we also see many more people who are now disaffiliating later in life, right? A lot of the young people, they really exhibit that drift story I was telling, right? Because now it's much more common that they're raised without a strong religious tradition. It's much more common that they're raised in households where religion is just not a huge deal. Young people are also more likely to work weird hours, right? And to have jobs that they have to work on the weekends. And they're much more likely to just sort of drift away from religion or have it, not be a thing in their lives to begin with. Among older populations, we definitely see much more of the break hypothesis. We see many more people who made a conscious choice to leave religion for personal reasons, for ideological reasons, right? Because historically, that was more of a strong choice that you had to make to break out of that socialization, right? So while we do see differences in sort of the profiles of how people are ending up non-religious, right? We see a wide variation in the age range of people who are non-religious today, if that makes sense.
Yes, I live on Abbott Avenue South between 46th and 47th Street. I'm the only person who gets up in the morning on Sundays to go to church, to go to the society. And all the rest of my neighbors, some are a few old like I am, a few middle-aged. We're getting crop of younger people with children moving in. And we have a little segment there that I think deserves to be studied of and by itself. The other question I have is, where do you get funding? Because I'm assuming that government funding would not really be that available. You have angels out there that are really interested in this, because this is going to cost quite a bit of money, I would assume. Anyway, I'd like your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is a great question because this is actually a thing I very much like sharing with folks in community organizations when we leave the university, because oftentimes university research can sound big and impressive, right? But we don't share the details and people don't get to see behind the scenes of how these projects are actually done and how these get off the ground. And they take a very long time because you do have to fund them. It's pretty expensive to run a high quality survey sample, like we talked about earlier. The cheapest version, right, an online nationally representative sample that can get enough people, will run at minimum, I was checking the numbers on, will run at minimum about $20,000. An effective targeted survey sample of the Twin Cities population alone will run approximately $75,000. And so these are not easy data to collect. There's a lot of labor involved. There's a lot of recruitment involved. You potentially have to pay participants to incentivize them to take the survey. And so we need to get funding. Now, there are ways that we fund these projects through the university system. So we are often writing grants through not only the universities that we're at, but also through scholarly organizations that fund research in religion, fund research on community well-being, fund research on institutions. But we also do rely on community organizations, right? We do rely on angel investors. We do rely on foundations. We rely on people who fund social science research, sometimes out of personal endowments or sometimes out of inheritances or such. And so these are kind of ongoing conversations, and it takes a lot of work to get a project to that point. A lot of design work, a lot of fundraising work. But thankfully, we do get these projects off the ground. If you or anyone you know is interested in funding academic research as a way to leave a legacy or as a way to sort of advance your community, we would love to talk to you. And also, if you're not interested in funding this project, the university would love to talk to you. Almost every university, right, is always looking for ways to support new and up-and-coming research, especially from its graduate students, right? I think one of the best charitable things people can do is fund endowments for research that supports new scholarship, right? New scholars who are entering the field, who are less well-established and who need pots of money to, say, launch a dissertation project or, thank you.
I was wondering if you have any hypotheses about how the needs of humanist populations are not being served by existing institutions. What information do you have that their needs are not already being optimally served by, humanist congregations like some Unitarian Universalists?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will throw it over to Chris because I think he's got a different perspective, and Jackie because I think she's got a different perspective if you want to answer this as well. But my sense from the survey research literature is that one of the core traits that I can say about religiously unaffiliated people is that they're very skeptical of institutions, particularly church institutions, right? And so I think many people in this population can see ways that organizations like a Unitarian organization or other community groups, I think they are capable of seeing ways that these groups can meet their needs. But I think there is a skepticism of the church model, right? I think there is a distrust of the church model. I think that for many people who leave religion based on the break hypothesis, for example, they center a lot of those problems not necessarily in theological belief systems, but in interpersonal problems that came through church institutions and the church model, right? So I think one of the unique ways to reach this population is it's one way that pushes existing communities of faith, existing church and community organizations to really think about, okay, what is it about our organization, right, that might be driving people away? What is it about our organization that can bring people in, right? And it may require changing the messaging strategy. It may require rethinking how the organization is structured. I'm not sure, but I think those kind of institutional concerns, that kind of institutional skepticism, is one of the things we see cropping up over and over again in the survey research.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I've had the opportunity over the last decade to travel around the country, visit humanist and atheist and secular groups all over. And one of the refrains that I've heard time and time again is that, if only people knew about what we were doing, then they would, we have something to offer them, which I think on the one hand is absolutely true. On the other hand, I do suspect that it's not just a messaging issue. It's not just an awareness issue. It's also a sort of functional issue. I'm less of a data person. I'm more of a story and anecdote person. But so I brought my younger brother here, who is an atheist. He loves watching atheist YouTube videos and listening to atheist podcasts. And I brought him here, and he loved what he heard. He loved the message here. Nothing about the experience here made him feel sort of like his worldview and values weren't being spoken to. He still listens to podcasts of the Sunday messages, but he has not sort of come back. And I've asked him why he's not interested in coming back. And he's just said it just feels like church to him. There's singing, there's pews. It's just not what he's looking for. And I suspect that if we want to serve this religiously unaffiliated population, we have to do more than just think about what our messaging is, how are we talking about what we do, and how are we helping people become more aware that a community for humanists can exist. But I also think some of it is a model issue. The way, as someone who has spent the better part of a decade building humanist communities that very much model themselves off of religious institutions, weekly gatherings, messages, opportunities for service, a lot of the things that you find in a religious congregation or institution, we've done in a humanist way. But I think we may actually have to be willing to radically rethink what community looks like, how it functions, if we want to serve this population. And what I think that means is, we might have to let go of some things, but it also, I think, is an opportunity to, try new things and to gain new things. And that's what excites me about the idea of a humanist center that could work in partnership with an institution like FUS, because it could learn from the ways that FUS has been really sort of breaking ground on humanist community life for many years and has a lot of wisdom to share and has a lot of strengths as an institution. But it could also try new things that are informed by research that could help reach a population that maybe just isn't going to resonate with this model, and recognizing that there are different needs in different segments of the population. So, yeah. Was there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just have like a research-based anecdote.
Yeah.
So in studying the Sunday Assembly over about 3 years, and like from their first assembly to about last year, the first few assemblies were very filled. There was 50 to 60 people here, but every week there was a new 50 to 60 people here. And so there was a lot of interest in what it could be. So those of you who don't know what Sunday Assembly is, it's very similar to probably your services. It's kind of more like a church-like form of community. And so people didn't end up coming back to it, but a lot of people that I talked to also were not super interested in organizations like the Minnesota Atheists, who are kind of more speaker-based, a little bit more intellectual type of community. And so there was like, they saw them as being kind of on two sides of a spectrum and that there wasn't something in between. And so my dissertation is kind of asking what does that in between kind of look like and what does that mean? So.
Okay, Becca, and then I'll go around to Eric.
Yeah, so I hope that the survey includes questions that their need for connection might be being served by their running club, they're going to the breweries, or look at what else they're doing that connects them to others. I would hope you're looking at that.
Yeah, we think that that is an excellent point, and I really want to emphasize that. One of the core problems we found when we go into the literature is that there are great surveys on religious engagement, there are great surveys on volunteering and community participation and community engagement, and those questions are never on the same survey. right? So one of our big things that we're doing is trying to take those kind of questions about activities that you mentioned and make sure they're integrated into a survey that has enough questions about religious life, so that we're able to compare and detect patterns that run across these.
Yeah, and I think my suspicion is that a lot of folks who have left religious institutions are finding community and making meaning and sense of their lives in this sort of piecemeal way. They're finding, a sense of community in a running group. They're reflecting on their lives on social media. They're kind of taking, opportunities in different places for these things. And what I hope we'll understand better after doing this survey is that working? What maybe is sort of falling through the cracks in this kind of piecemeal approach that folks would get if they were involved in an institution. So hopefully we'll have a better understanding of, because it may be the case that all of those needs are being really adequately met and there isn't a need for any other kind of institution. But I suspect that there are gaps. So we'll see.
I'm fascinated by the survey. I believe that you indicated that about 4% of the people in the survey self-identified as atheists, and about 4%, including me, self-identify as agnostics. Don't know the answers, interested in the questions. But your survey would indicate this other group, 15%, that equal to the combined total of atheists and agnostics, who would consider us too organized.
Who would consider what?
Would consider us too organized.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I know that we're supposed to wrap up here around 10:15, so I think we probably...
10:20.
Oh, 10:20. So I think we probably have time for one or two more questions, but I will say, just to make sure it's said before we wrap up, that if this is a project that you're interested in, if you have additional questions or thoughts, or you would like to contribute in some way, please come talk to us. We would love to explore what that would look like, and we'd love to have your involvement.
Good morning, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I am curious about, Jackie, is that your name? You said that there's maybe something sort of in between the model between kind of a society like this, a sort of churchy model, and what the Sunday assemblies are doing, or maybe
in the Minnesota Atheists.
Oh,
kind
in
of
the
less
Minnesota
church-like.
Atheists. That's right. Yeah, that there's something in between. So I'd be curious to know what you think that in between model might look like, and I'm just curious about this notion that people have running clubs and beer drinking clubs or whatever they have that sort of meet their various needs. I wonder if there's a place in the research where you get a sense of the shared message that's heard, in a speaker sort of focused kind of organization, that there's really something about, to me, the shared message that's heard in whatever context it is.
Yeah, so you're asking like a group like Minnesota Atheists, is there as much of a shared message as a group where there's like new speakers every month, right? So like there's less of a kind of a service every week where there's like kind of a leader that gives kind of more, not like sermons, but like something similar to kind of like an overall kind of holistic message of...
I mean, I guess I was asking two separate questions. What's the in-between that you might be hearing about? And then also in the research, does it suggest that there's some value to the unaffiliated people hearing a shared message and sharing? Is that part of the community piece?
Yeah, actually so to answer your question of what is the in-between, I think I don't know yet. And that's what we're trying to figure out with this survey is like, if you don't like this version and you don't like this version, what might be the answer to that? And most of the people I interviewed don't have a good, so I asked them, what does community mean to you? What would be, what does a community look like to you? And there's just answers across the board. And so I'm still working on like, what are some themes there? But I think in terms of like sociological research on like what makes a group work or what makes even like a religion work, it is like a shared message. So a lot of people aren't finding kind of an overall message at a less church-like group, but then they also don't like the one message that you might hear at a church-like group. And so it's like, it's very complicated. So yeah, we're trying to work it through.
Don't you think there will be a big difference in the responses, whether people live in rural areas, farms, or small towns compared to the people you survey in larger cities?
That's a very good question. I would wager that we would see different patterns in response rates. I would wager that we would probably see a sort of stronger common commitment to a smaller number of community organizations in the rural or the sort of, less populated areas than we would in the large urban spaces. And I think that's I think this gets to the core of some of the big patterns that we're trying to identify, especially for organizations like First Unitarian, right? As more and more people move to large urban areas, as we start to see more and more people exiting rural and sort of more suburban areas, right? What kind of patterns and social changes will that invite in terms of the community organizations that they gravitate towards, right? Because the main pattern you see is people now have a buffet of options when they move to the city, right? Sure, you can go to your church organization. There is a church that will probably match up closely with one you had back home in the rural areas, but there's also the bowling league, the beer drinking club, the anime club, the atheist group, there's a much wider, right? And so as people have those more sort of targeted options, right? The question is, do they seek out a common unifying message, to your question, or do they seek out a more piecemeal experience, right? Where they go to a few organizations that match their interests and don't necessarily go to one that holistically builds community across very different experiences. And I think that is a question that we are definitely trying to figure out.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think one of the big things that I'm hoping to understand as someone who comes from a community organizing background is if they are moving in this more piecemeal direction, which that's my sense, but it's an assumption. What again is sort of missing in that approach? And one of the senses I have is that there's a profound difference between a shared interest group and a space that sort of is more about accountability. It's about reminding you that you're trying to live in a certain way, that you're trying to practice a set of values that you might be less able to do just sort of on your own volition without a sort of group of people that are also trying to live out those values. And so one of the questions I hope that we're going to have a better answer to or a better sense of after we do this is how are folks holding themselves accountable to their values? How are they reflecting on their lives and their responsibilities to the world around them outside of institutions like FUS and others? And are they doing those things? Are they doing them well? Or are there sort of missing pieces? And I think that's probably, one of the reasons why it would be our ultimate preference would be to do a sort of more localized survey, and a nationally representative one is to see if there are differences as well between what's happening here and what's happening on a broader level, including across urban and rural divides. But I also suspect that there are things about our specific context here that are unique. I know Minnesotans love to think that we're different from everybody else, but I do think that there are real differences, and I'm sort of curious what those are. So, thanks.